There is a photograph that does not exist in most people's memory of the Middle East, and yet it was real. Tehran in the mid-1970s. Israeli engineers walking through the lobby of a hotel near the old bazaar, speaking quietly in Hebrew, carrying blueprints for a missile program that their government was building in partnership with the Shah of Iran. El Al aircraft descending through the brown haze toward Mehrabad Airport on regular commercial routes. Iranian crude moving westward through a pipeline that terminated on the Israeli coast, feeding refineries that kept the lights on in Tel Aviv. A Mossad station inside the Iranian capital, working shoulder to shoulder with Samvak, the Shah's intelligence service, exchanging files on shared enemies across the Arab world. None of this was a secret, the way secrets are usually kept. And it was simply the ordinary architecture of a relationship that almost nobody outside the two governments bothered to look at directly. And then, within the span of a few short months, all of it was gone. Not weakened, not strained, gone. The engineers left, the flight stopped, the pipeline emptied, the embassy in Tehran was handed keys and furniture and all to representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization, as if to announce in the clearest possible language that the building itself had changed sides. The country that had been one of Israel's closest non-Arab partners for 3 decades began referring to it, from the highest pulpits of its new government, as an enemy whose existence was an affront to God. This is the contradiction most histories of the Middle East quietly step around. The shadow war that now defines an entire region, the assassinations, the cyber sabotage, the proxy militias, the drone barrages lighting up the night sky over Jerusalem, did not emerge from some ancient and inevitable hatred buried in scripture or soil. It was not written into the geography. It was not encoded in the blood. It was built deliberately, rapidly, and by specific people making specific choices inside a very narrow window of history. And once it was built, it proved almost impossible to dismantle. What follows is the timeline that most explanations skip: the decades of cooperation that preceded the rupture, the precise inflection point where ideology overrode strategy, the strange interval in which the two new enemies continued in secret to do business with each other, even as their leaders called for mutual destruction. And the slow migration of the conflict from rhetoric into proxies, from proxies into sabotage, from sabotage into cyber weapons, and finally, in our own decade, from the shadows into the open sky. There is a thread running through all of it, and the thread begins not with enmity, but with a friendship so complete that its erasure remains, even now, one of the most astonishing reversals in modern diplomatic history. To understand how it ended, we have to begin where almost no one begins, with how it started, with the logic of an alliance that once seemed to the men who built it as permanent as the mountains between them. To understand why the alliance existed in the first place, you have to return to a map that no longer looks the way it did in 1948, and to a feeling that the founders of Israel carried with them like a second heartbeat. And the feeling was encirclement. The map showed it plainly. A narrow coastal state, newly declared, surrounded on almost every landward side by nations that had refused to recognize its existence and had, in several cases, gone to war to extinguish it in its first hours. Egypt to the south, Syria and Lebanon to the north, Jordan and Iraq to the east. Beyond them, the wider Arab world, stitched together by a shared language, a shared grievance, and a shared determination that the new country on the Mediterranean should not be permitted to take root. For the men sitting in Tel Aviv, trying to imagine how such a state could possibly survive its own first decade, The arithmetic was brutal and the horizon was short. David Ben-Gurion, the country's first prime minister, understood that arithmetic better than almost anyone, and he understood something else as well. If the ring of hostility ran along Israel's immediate borders, then the answer could not be found inside that ring. It had to be found beyond it, past the nearest enemies, further out, where other nations sat who were not Arab, who did not share in the same grievance, and who might, for reasons of their own, see a quiet partnership with this small, improbable country as useful. He called the idea the periphery. The strategy was to reach past the circle of immediate enemies and build discrete relationships with the powers along its outer edge. Non-Arab states with their own interests, their own anxieties, their own reasons to look for allies in unexpected places. Turkey to the northwest, a secular republic uneasy with Arab nationalism. Ethiopia to the south, is Christian-led and navigating its own fragile position in a turbulent region. And further east across the Persian Gulf, the largest and most consequential of them all, Iran. Iran was not an accident in this picture. It was the keystone, a country with oil, with a long imperial memory, with a ruling dynasty that saw itself as heir to something older and grander than the Arab world that pressed against its western frontier. Iran had recognized Israel quietly but unmistakably in 1948, becoming one of the very first Muslim-majority nations to do so. The recognition was never loud. It was never celebrated with embassies flying full flags on busy avenues. But it was real, and it mattered, because it told Ben-Gurion and the men around him that the periphery was not a theory. It was already, in its earliest form, a fact on the ground. For the Shah, the calculation ran in the other direction, but arrived at the same conclusion. He looked at the Arab nationalism rising around him, at Nasser's Egypt in particular, and he saw a movement that threatened to swallow Iran's regional influence whole. An alliance with Israel, kept just quiet enough to avoid open provocation, gave him leverage. Israeli intelligence on Arab governments, Israeli technical expertise on projects his own ministries could not yet manage. A back channel to Washington through a country that had become, by the 1960s, one of the most trusted partners of the American security establishment. For the Shah, Israel was not an ideological cause. It was an instrument, a useful, discreet, capable instrument, and he intended to use it. What grew out of these two converging needs was not a public friendship. It was a secret architecture, a network of agreements, cooperations, and understandings that ran beneath the official surface of Middle Eastern politics, unseen by most observers of the region, and deliberately kept that way by both governments. From the outside, Israel and Iran had almost nothing to do with each other. From the inside, they had almost everything. And the scale of that everything, the specific projects that filled the architecture with weight and substance, is where the strangeness of this story truly begins to reveal itself. The first pillar of that architecture was oil, and the pipeline that carried it told you almost everything you needed to know about how serious the two countries had become about each other. It began at the port of Eilat, on Israel's slender southern tip, and where tankers from the Persian Gulf could offload Iranian crude without ever having to navigate the Suez Canal, a waterway that had become, after 1967, effectively closed to any cargo bound for an Israeli destination. From Eilat, the oil moved overland through a pipeline that crossed the Negev desert and terminated at Ashkelon on the Mediterranean coast, where it could be refined for Israeli consumption or loaded onto other tankers bound for European markets. The arrangement solved a problem for both countries at once. Iran had oil it needed to sell and wanted routes that did not depend on the goodwill of Arab neighbors. Israel needed energy and wanted a supplier whose willingness to deliver would not evaporate the next time a crisis flared in Cairo or Damascus. The pipeline was profitable, it was strategic, and it ran for years without the rest of the world paying it much attention at all. The second pillar was harder to see, and that was by design. It had a name that sounded like a gardening catalog, Project Flower. Behind the innocuous label sat one of the most ambitious joint military undertakings of the 1970s, a program in which Israeli engineers and Iranian officials worked together on the development of a surface-to-surface missile intended to give both countries a strategic reach they could not yet build alone. For Israel, the program offered access to financing and to a partner whose geography placed it within range of adversaries that Israeli missiles could not easily threaten from home soil. For Iran, it offered access to a level of technical sophistication that the Shah's own defense industries had not yet achieved. Yet documents and discussions moved back and forth between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Engineers flew in both directions. Sites were surveyed. The project was not quite complete when the revolution arrived, and its unfinished pieces would become, in later years, a source of considerable unease for both governments, each wondering exactly how much the other now knew. Beneath the pipeline and the missile program ran the third and perhaps the most intimate layer of the alliance, intelligence. The Mossad and Savak, the Shah's secret police, developed a working relationship that went well beyond the occasional exchange of files. Israeli officers trained Iranian counterparts in methods of surveillance, interrogation, and operational security. Iranian officers, in turn, even passed along information on Arab governments that the Mossad could not easily gather on its own, drawing on Iran's diplomatic reach across a region that was largely closed to Israeli access. The two services came to trust each other in the peculiar way that intelligence services sometimes do, bound together by the shared secrets they held and by the knowledge that exposure would be catastrophic for both. Their cooperation was almost never written about at the time. It did not need to be. It simply worked. Around these three pillars, smaller cooperations multiplied. Israeli agronomists arrived in Iran to advise on irrigation and on the transformation of arid land into productive farmland, bringing with them techniques that had been refined in the Negev and the Jordan Valley. Israeli military advisors worked quietly alongside Iranian officers on training programs and logistical systems. Construction firms from Israel took contracts in Iranian cities, building roads and facilities that carried no flag and attracted no headlines. A small but steady community of Israeli professionals came to live in Tehran, sending their children to local schools, learning enough Persian to navigate the markets, and forming friendships with Iranian colleagues that in some cases would outlast the regimes that had first brought them together. This was the texture of the alliance in its fullest years. Not a declaration read from a podium, but 1,000 small, practical, daily acts of cooperation that had accumulated over more than 2 decades into something that looked, from the inside, almost indistinguishable from a full partnership between two ordinary friendly states. And it is precisely because the intimacy had gone so deep, had threaded itself so completely into the working life of both countries, that what happened next would feel not like a diplomatic adjustment, but like a severing. The year hangs in the modern imagination like a door slammed in the middle of a sentence. Before it, one world, to after it, another. and between them, almost no transition at all, only the sound of something enormous giving way. For most of the 1970s, the alliance between Israel and Iran had felt less like a policy and more like a fact of geography. Engineers moved between Tel Aviv and Tehran the way accountants move between branch offices. Oil flowed, intelligence flowed, letters of credit flowed. The machinery hummed so steadily that those inside it began to assume the hum was permanent, that whatever else changed in the Middle East, this quiet artery would keep pulsing beneath the noise. And then, in a matter of weeks, it stopped. The Shah left Tehran on the 16th of January, 1979, in a small ceremony that tried very hard to look like a vacation. He kissed the soil. He boarded a plane. He did not come back. 2 weeks later, on the 1st of February, an Air France jet descended out of a gray Paris sky and delivered Ruhollah Khomeini to a country that had been waiting for him with a patience that bordered on prayer. Millions lined the roads from Mehrabad Airport into the city. The crowds did not cheer so much as exhale, a long collective breath held for 15 years, finally released. Within that exhalation, the old architecture began to dissolve. It dissolved faster than anyone in Jerusalem had prepared for. Israeli diplomats in Tehran had spent the final months of 1978 sending cables back to the foreign ministry, cables that grew steadily more anxious and steadily less believed. Surely the reasoning went in Jerusalem. Whatever government replaced the Shah would recognize the logic that had bound the two countries together for 3 decades. Surely oil was still oil. Surely the Soviets were still the Soviets. Surely pragmatism, that quiet god of statecraft, would outlast the theater of revolution. It did not. By the middle of February, the Israeli embassy staff were packing. By the 17th, they were gone. And on the 18th of February, 1979, something happened that no one in the Periphery Doctrine's long history had imagined possible. The keys to the Israeli embassy in Tehran, the same building where only months earlier trade delegations had sipped tea and discussed pipeline capacity, were handed ceremonially and deliberately to a representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat himself arrived in Tehran to accept them. The building was not closed. It was not neutralized. It was transferred like a trophy to the very movement the alliance had been built to counter. The symbolism was surgical. Whoever chose that gesture, Yasser understood exactly what it meant in Jerusalem. It was not merely a severance of ties. It was a reversal of them, a deliberate inversion of the map that had guided Israeli strategy since 1948, and the language followed the gesture. So within weeks, a new vocabulary entered Iranian public life, vocabulary that would harden over the coming years into something close to liturgy. The United States became the great Satan. Israel became the little Satan, smaller in scale, but in the logic of the new revolutionary grammar, no less metaphysical, an enemy. These were not diplomatic terms. They were theological ones. You do not negotiate with Satan. You do not sign pipeline agreements with Satan. You do not, in the long run, share a planet with Satan peacefully. In Jerusalem, the analysts read the speeches and tried to decide how much of it to believe. Some argued it was rhetoric, the standard overheated language of any revolution in its first flush, and that in 18 months the old pragmatism would reassert itself the way it always had. And the Iranians still needed spare parts for their American-built military. The Iranians still feared the Soviets to their north and the Iraqis to their west. The Iranians still, in the cold calculus of regional survival, needed someone, surely. Others, fewer in number but louder in retrospect, argued that something genuinely new had entered the region, that ideology was not a costume the new regime would shed, but a skeleton it had grown into, and that the periphery doctrine, the patient architecture of decades, had just been declared dead by men who did not even know its name. Both readings, in a strange way, turned out to be correct. That was the deepest strangeness of 1979, though it would take years to surface. Publicly, the rupture was total. Privately, as later chapters of this story will reveal, the old machinery was not entirely dismantled. Some wires impossibly remained live. Some channels impossibly remained open. The official severance was real. It was also, in ways almost no one outside a very small room in Tel Aviv understood and complete. But in the spring of 1979, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was the speed, the dizzying, disorienting speed of it. 3 decades of quiet cooperation undone between one winter and the next. An embassy handed over, a vocabulary rewritten, a map redrawn by men who had been exiles only months before and who now spoke of Jerusalem the way earlier generations had spoken of Mecca and Medina, as a place whose fate was written into the meaning of the world itself. The door had slammed, publicly, completely, theatrically, and in the echo of that slam, most observers assumed the story was over, that whatever came next between these two countries would be hostility, and only hostility, a long, cold enmity sliding slowly toward whatever end such enmities tend toward. They were wrong, because even as the embassy changed hands, even as the new vocabulary hardened into scripture, something else was already beginning to stir, something the cameras would never see, something the speeches would never admit, something that would, within only a few years, make the public rupture of 1979 look like the simplest chapter in a far stranger book. The thing about ideology is that it needs infrastructure. A slogan can be shouted from a balcony in an afternoon. An embassy can be handed over in a morning. But turning an idea into a force that touches other countries, that reaches across borders, that draws blood, that reshapes maps, requires something slower. It requires roads. It requires trainers. It requires money moving quietly through accounts in cities far from the cameras. It requires, above all, patience. In the spring of 1982, that patience found its opening. Israel crossed into southern Lebanon in June of that year, an operation called Peace for Galilee, aimed at pushing the PLO out of artillery range of northern Israeli towns. The tanks moved quickly. Within days, they were at the outskirts of Beirut. Within weeks, the PLO was negotiating its exit from Lebanon altogether, sailing away to Tunis under international supervision. By the usual measures of military success, the operation had achieved its stated goal. But wars do not end where their stated goals end. Wars end where the vacuums they create are filled. And the vacuum that opened in southern Lebanon in the summer of 1982 would be filled by something no Israeli planner had anticipated and no map of the region had yet drawn. They arrived quietly in small groups through the Bekaa Valley. Men from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the force that had been created 3 years earlier in Tehran to protect the revolution from enemies foreign and domestic. Now, for the first time, the revolution was exporting itself, a few hundred at first, then more. They brought rifles, but rifles were not what mattered. What mattered was what they carried in their heads, a template, a method, a way of turning local grievance into organized force. The Bekaa in 1982 was fertile ground for such a template. Lebanon's Shia population is along the poorest and least represented of the country's many communities, was living through a war that had arrived on their doorstep without asking permission. Israeli tanks to the south, Syrian troops to the north, Christian militias, Sunni militias, Palestinian fighters, all moving through villages that had wanted none of them. Into this exhaustion, the men from Tehran spoke a language that was new and old at once, the language of resistance, yes, but also the language of meaning, of a grievance lifted out of local mud and placed inside a cosmic frame. The training camps went up in valleys the cameras could not reach. Weapons arrived on flights that were not listed on any manifest. Money arrived in forms that left no receipts. And slowly through 1982 and into 1983, something began to cohere. Not a militia in the ordinary sense. Lebanon already had dozens of those. Something stranger. A movement with a theology, a hierarchy, a patron state, and a horizon that stretched far beyond the olive groves of the South. It did not yet have a name the world would recognize. That came later. In 1985, a document was released in Beirut, an open letter addressed grandly to the downtrodden of Lebanon and the world. It announced the existence of a movement called Hezbollah, the Party of God. It laid out a program. Some of that program concerned Lebanon itself, the expulsion of foreign forces, the rights of the dispossessed, the rejection of the sectarian political order. But woven into the document was another thread, and it was this thread that would define the next 40 years of the Shadow War. The obliteration of Israel was named not as a tactical goal, but as a religious and historical necessity. Not a border dispute to be resolved, not a grievance to be negotiated, a condition to be ended. The language was absolute, and the absoluteness was the point. A movement that defines its enemy in absolute terms cannot later soften without ceasing to be itself. This was architecture designed not to bend. And behind the architecture, invisible but unmistakable, stood Tehran. The money came from Tehran. The weapons came through Tehran. The strategic doctrine, the patient, layered idea of a long war fought at low cost through local hands, came from Tehran. Hezbollah was not a creation of Iran in the crude sense that critics sometimes imply. It had its own leaders, its own local roots, and its own internal logic that would surprise its patrons more than once in the decades to come. But it was also not, as its defenders sometimes claimed, a purely organic Lebanese phenomenon that merely happened to share Tehran's worldview. The truth sat in between, and the in-between was itself the innovation, a proxy that was real enough to fight, independent enough to deny, and loyal enough to answer when called. This was the birth of something new in the region, new at least at this scale. Iran had discovered that it did not need to share a border with Israel to fight Israel. It needed only to share a theology with someone who did. Distance, which had once been the obstacle to the periphery doctrine working in reverse, now became the instrument. The farther Tehran sat from the actual battlefield, the harder it was to hold Tehran accountable for what happened there. Deniability was not a side effect. It was the design. By the late 1980s, the infrastructure was mature enough that it no longer looked like infrastructure. It looked like a fact of the landscape, as if Hezbollah had always been in southern Lebanon, as if the rockets had always been pointed south, as if the logic had always been this. A generation of young men in the Bekaa was growing up inside the frame, and for them the frame was not a frame at all. It was simply the shape of the world. In Jerusalem, the analysts watched and understood slowly what had happened. The rupture of 1979 had not been the end of the story. It had been the overture. The real composition was being written now in valleys, in training camps, and sermons and account books, and it would take decades to perform in full. The enmity was no longer just declared, it was institutional. It had payrolls, it had logistics, it had a second generation coming of age inside it. And yet, and this is where the story bends into its strangest chapter, even as this machinery of enmity was being assembled in the Bekaa, another machinery was running in parallel, in the opposite direction, carrying cargo that nothing in the public record of these years could explain. Planes were landing at airfields that were not supposed to exist on any flight path between these two countries. Crates were being unloaded that were not supposed to have been loaded. Signatures were appearing on documents in languages whose speakers were officially enemies unto death. The public war was being built. The secret war was being built. And the two were being built by some of the same hands. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a story when the official version stops matching the documents. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a room where everyone present knows something that no one present is willing to say aloud. For most of the 1980s, the story of Israel and Iran lived inside that silence. On the surface, the war of words was at its peak. Tehran's Friday sermons named Israel as the lesser devil in a cosmology of devils. Jerusalem's ministers warned of an ideological state that had made annihilation into scripture. The vocabulary of 1979 had not softened. It had hardened into liturgy, repeated so often that repetition itself became a kind of proof. And yet, beneath the liturgy, beneath the sermons and the warnings and the slogans painted on walls from Tehran to Tel Aviv, cargo was moving. Not metaphorical cargo, just real cargo. Heavy, crated, serial-numbered cargo that weighed the axles of aircraft down onto runways in places that were not supposed to exist on any shared map. The Iran-Iraq War had begun in September of 1980, and within a year it had become the longest and cruelest conventional war the region had seen in decades. Saddam Hussein's army, armed by nearly everyone who had anything to sell, pushed into Iranian territory and then bogged down in a grinding stalemate that would eventually consume something close to 1 million lives. Iran, isolated by its own revolution, sanctioned and shunned, found itself fighting a modern war with an arsenal it could no longer service. Its air force was American-built. Its tanks were American-built. Its spare parts were American-built. And its suppliers, one by one, had closed their doors. Into that desperation, a strange logic began to assert itself in a very small number of rooms in Tel Aviv. The logic went like this. Iraq, under Saddam, was the larger immediate danger. A Ba'athist state with chemical weapons, ambitions of regional dominance, and a border that touched Jordan and through Jordan touched everything. Iran, for all its revolutionary theater, was farther away, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and here was the calculation that mattered: bleeding. A bleeding Iran was a distracted Iran. A distracted Iran was not, in the practical sense, Israel's most urgent problem, and a Ba'athist Iraq that won decisively against a bleeding Iran would be. The periphery doctrine, declared dead in 1979, was not dead. It was unconscious. And in the cold rooms where such calculations are made, someone chose to wake it up. The operation went by names that appeared only in files most citizens of either country would never see. Operation Seashell was one of them. The outlines, as they later emerged through leaked documents, congressional investigations, and the slow erosion of secrecy that time performs on everything, sketched a picture that nothing in the public record of these years had prepared the world for. Israeli brokered shipments of spare parts, ammunition, tires, tank components, and missile-related equipment moving through intermediaries in Europe, through shell companies in places whose tax codes had been designed for exactly this kind of forgetting, and arriving eventually at Iranian airfields. The estimates of total value varied with the source. Some put it in the low hundreds of millions of dollars. Some pushed it toward 500 million and beyond. The precise figure mattered less than the fact of it. The fact of it was the scandal. And then in 1985 and 1986, so the operation surfaced into the wider American story that history would eventually call Iran-Contra. Okay? The outlines are familiar in broad strokes, and the broad strokes are the part that matters here. Israeli officials had been urging Washington quietly to consider a limited opening to elements within the Iranian regime. Factions, it was argued, who might be coaxed toward pragmatism if only the right objects changed hands. Missiles, as it turned out, were the right objects. Tau anti-tank missiles, Hawk anti-aircraft components. The cargo moved. And as the hostages in Lebanon, American citizens held by groups linked through the long chain of Tehran's influence to the same ecosystem that had produced Hezbollah, became the currency of the exchange. Money flowed back out through channels that eventually reached Nicaraguan rebels, which was how the whole affair collapsed into American headlines in November of 1986. But the American scandal, loud as it was, obscured the older and quieter one underneath it, because the Israeli channel to Iran had not begun with Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra had merely, for a brief moment, made the Israeli channel visible. The channel itself was older. The channel itself had been running in some form almost from the moment the embassy keys had been handed to the PLO in 1979. The rupture had been total in vocabulary and incomplete in practice. Jistrim and the gap between the two was where the arms flowed. Think about what this means. Think about it slowly, because it is a kind of fact that rearranges a story if you let it sit long enough. The same years in which Tehran's sermons were naming Israel as a metaphysical enemy were the years in which Iranian pilots were flying aircraft kept aloft by Israeli brokered parts. The same years in which Hezbollah was being trained in the Bekaa to destroy Israel were the years in which Israeli intermediaries were meeting in hotel rooms in European capitals with Iranian officials who needed what only those intermediaries could deliver. The public war and the secret cooperation were not sequential. They were not even parallel. They were braided, each strand touching the other, each strand pretending not to know the other existed, in each strand necessary to the shape of the whole. And the men who made these decisions on both sides were not hypocrites in the cartoon sense. They were something stranger and harder to judge. They were people who had decided quietly that two contradictory things could be true at once, and that statecraft was the art of living inside the contradiction without letting it tear you apart. On Jerusalem, the calculation was that a weakened Iran fighting a weakened Iraq was, on balance, better than either a victorious Iraq or a collapsed Iran whose weapons and territory would be inherited by no one knew whom. In Tehran, the calculation was that a regime fighting for its survival could accept material from the devil himself and theologize the acceptance later. Both calculations were, in their own terms, coherent. Both calculations required, as their price of admission, a willingness to say one thing in public and do another in private, and to do so not as a brief tactical lapse, but as a sustained policy spanning years. This is the moment in the story where the viewer's whole understanding of the shadow war has to bend, because everything that came before The periphery doctrine, the rupture of 1979, the birth of Hezbollah, the sermons, the slogans suddenly has to be reread through a lens that the sermons and slogans themselves had tried to make impossible. If enemies unto death can ship each other weapons for a decade, then the word enemy is not doing the work we thought it was doing. It is doing some other, stranger, more ambiguous work. It is a label attached to a relationship whose actual contents may be the opposite of the label or orthogonal to the label. Most unsettling of all, partially true and partially false in ways that depend on which file you are reading, on which day, from which capital. The periphery doctrine had not died in 1979. It had gone underground. It had learned to live without daylight, to move through intermediaries, to speak through silences, to survive on the pragmatism of men who understood that states, unlike theologies, cannot afford to be consistent. And underground in those years, it kept a quiet flame alive, the flame of an idea that these two countries, for all the vocabulary between them, were still in some cold and calculating part of their respective minds, more useful to each other alive than dead. That flame would eventually gutter. The 1990s would come, and with them, new calculations, new fears, a new object around which the enmity would crystallize into something that neither side could any longer manage through back channels. But before we go there, it is worth sitting for a moment inside the strangeness of what has just been revealed, sitting with the fact that the cleanest story of ancient hatred, of inevitable collision, of two peoples destined to fight, does not survive contact with the documents. The documents tell a different story. The documents tell a story in which the enmity was built and the cooperation was also built, and the same hands sometimes built, both on the same day. This is the midpoint of our timeline and the midpoint of our understanding. Everything before it looked like a collapse. Everything after it will look like a construction, the deliberate construction of a war that had, for a brief, strange interval, very nearly refused to become one. The loudest years in a long war are rarely the ones that decide it. The years that decide it are usually the quiet ones. The years when nothing seems to be happening, when the headlines move on to other countries and other crises, when the cameras find fresher wounds to photograph. It is in those years, in the long exhale after a crisis and before the next one, that the machinery being built in the shadows hardens into something that cannot be unbuilt. For the shadow war between Israel and Iran, those years arrived in the late summer of 1988. The Iran-Iraq war ended not with a victory, but with an exhaustion. Khomeini, in a phrase that would echo for decades, described his acceptance of the ceasefire as drinking a chalice of poison. The front lines stopped moving. The trenches began to empty. A generation of young men who had spent their adolescence in those trenches came home to a country that no longer quite knew what to do with them. And in the rooms where the secret arms channels had been run on both sides, the files began slowly to close. The urgency that had animated Operation Seashell and its cousins evaporated with the ceasefire. There was no longer a bleeding Iran whose survival served Jerusalem's calculations. There was only an Iran catching its breath and counting its dead. The channels did not vanish overnight. Nothing in statecraft vanishes overnight, but they thinned. The meetings in European hotel rooms grew rarer. The intermediaries found other clients. The quiet flame of the underground periphery doctrine guttered not extinguished, but unattended, and in the space where it had burned, a different kind of silence settled in. From the outside, through the early 1990s, it looked almost like absence. Other stories took the oxygen. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the map of the world rearranged itself around that collapse. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the coalition that answered drew American troops into the Gulf in numbers that would not leave for a generation. The Oslo process began haltingly, and for a brief window, it seemed possible that the whole grammar of the region might be rewritten into something gentler. Analysts who had spent the 1980s tracking the Israeli-Iranian shadow found themselves writing about other things because the shadow itself had gone still. But still is not the same as gone. Beneath the stillness, two things were happening, and both of them would matter enormously. The first was that Hezbollah, unattended by the world's attention, was maturing. The movement that had been a collection of training camps in 1982 was, by the early 1990s, something closer to a state within a state. It had schools, it had clinics, it had a television station, it had a political wing preparing to contest Lebanese elections, and a military wing preparing to fight a kind of war that no conventional army had yet learned how to answer. The rockets accumulated in basements and olive groves. The tunnels began, in places, to be dug. The patient-layered doctrine that Tehran had sketched in 1982 was being built out in 3 dimensions, in concrete and fiber optic cable and payroll, and the building was happening during precisely the years when no one was watching, and the reach was lengthening. On a March afternoon in 1992, a truck detonated outside the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, collapsing the building and killing 29 people. 2 years later, in July of 1994, another bomb destroyed the AMIA Jewish Community Center in the same city, killing 85. The investigations took years, and their conclusions, when they came, pointed along a chain of responsibility that began in the Bekaa Valley and ran back to Tehran. The shadow war was no longer confined to the region. It had learned to travel. It had discovered that a diaspora is, for a patient enemy, a map of additional targets, and that distance from the original quarrel is not protection, but opportunity. The second thing happening in the quiet years was harder to see, and in the long run, more consequential. In a handful of facilities whose locations were not yet on any public map, in halls whose existence was officially denied, centrifuges were beginning to spin. Not many at first, not well at first, but spinning. The knowledge was being gathered, the scientists were being trained, the procurement networks were being stitched together through front companies in Dubai, in Kuala Lumpur, in cities whose customs officials had other things to worry about. A program was taking shape that its architects believed could be built in silence and revealed when the time came as a fact already accomplished. For now, though, none of this was visible. For now, the region looked almost like it was resting. The sermons still ran on Friday in Tehran, and the warnings still issued from Jerusalem, but the temperature of the enmity had dropped into something that could almost be mistaken for routine. An enmity maintained, not inflamed. An enmity managed, not fought. It was the stillness of a held breath. It was the stillness of a room in which something is being assembled quietly on a workbench in the corner, while the people in the room talk about other things and try not to look at the corner. The shadow war had not ended. It had only learned to wait. And then, in the first years of the new century, a word would enter the story that would end the waiting. a word that would reorganize every calculation on both sides, that would dissolve the patient ambiguity of the quiet years, that would turn the management of enmity back into the pursuit of it. The word was nuclear, and when it arrived, and it would bring with it a kind of clarity that neither side, in the end, would know what to do with. Section 8, the nuclear pivot. The bell struck in August of 2002, and the sound of it changed the frequency of the entire war. Until that summer, the shadow conflict between Israel and Iran had been a thing of proxies and pipelines, of couriers in Damascus and training camps in the Bekaa, of ledgers that balanced in rocket inventories and assassination files. It had a geography the intelligence services understood. It had rules, even if those rules were never written down. And then, in a Washington press conference delivered by an exiled opposition group with its own murky sponsors, two names entered the public record that would reorganize every assumption underneath the war. Natanz, Iraq, Yichu, a covert enrichment facility rising from the central Iranian plain, a heavy water reactor being built in the western mountains. Neither site had been declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Neither site matched the civilian nuclear program Tehran had spent years describing to the world. Inspectors arrived, so centrifuge cascades were photographed. The denials that followed were careful, lawyerly, and to the services reading them in Tel Aviv, familiar in their architecture. They were the denials of a program, not a plant. Inside Israel, the revelation did not arrive as news, it arrived as confirmation. For more than a decade, quiet assessments had been circulating through the Prime Minister's office and the Mossad's research directorate, assessments that traced a pattern of procurement. Vacuum pumps routed through Dubai, hemorrhaging steel through European intermediaries, centrifuge components whose end users never quite resolved. The pattern had been there. What 2002 provided was the place where the pattern lived, and with that place came a reframing so total that it reached backward through the entire history of the Shadow War and rewrote its meaning. Hezbollah was no longer simply a proxy army on the northern border. It was a deterrent belt around a nuclear project. The assassinations in Buenos Aires were no longer simply revenge operations. They were the overture to something that required time, and the time was being bought. Israeli strategic doctrine, which for decades had treated Iran as a regional adversary to be contained, began to speak a different word, existential. The word carried weight, the other words had not. And it was the word Israeli leaders used about the Holocaust, about 1948, about the hours before the Six-Day War. To apply it to Iran was to move the conflict into a different register entirely, a register in which proportionality was no longer the measure, in which the logic of managed war could no longer hold, in which the clock on the wall was no longer political but metallurgical. How many centrifuges? How much low enriched uranium? How many months from breakout? The services began to count in units that had no relationship to diplomacy, and yet diplomacy was tried. The Europeans opened a channel. Negotiations began in Tehran and Geneva and Vienna, negotiations that would continue in one form or another for more than a decade, through suspensions and resumptions and sanctions and interim agreements and the long architecture of what would eventually become the 2015 Accord. Through all of it, the centrifuges at Natanz continued to spin, faster in some years, slower in others, but never stopping. A second facility was quietly excavated into the mountain at Fordo, buried beneath enough rock to survive most conventional strikes. The program moved underground in the literal sense, and in doing so, it communicated something the diplomats could not override. Whatever was being built to survive being found. It was in this period, somewhere between the first inspections and the second facility, that a decision was made whose fingerprints would not become visible until years later. A decision that the conflict could no longer be fought only with proxies and intelligence, that code itself might be made to carry weight, that a weapon could be written instead of built. No one announced this decision, no cabinet voted on it, but in laboratories on 2 continents, something new began to take shape, something that would in time become the first true act of cyber war in human history, and the quietest explosion the 21st century had yet heard. Section 9, Stuxnet and the Scientists. The explosion, when it finally came, made no sound at all. It arrived inside Natanz the way weather arrives inside a sealed room, impossibly, and then, all at once. In the enrichment halls beneath the desert floor, the centrifuges had been spinning for months with a subtle wrongness that none of the engineers could quite locate. Rotors failed at rates the specifications did not predict. Cascades fell out of balance. Replacement units arrived, were installed, and failed again. The logs showed nothing. The monitoring systems reported normal operation, normal pressures, normal speeds, a plant behaving exactly as a plant should behave. And underneath those clean readings, something was quietly tearing the machine apart from the inside. The something had a name, though the name would not be spoken for another year. Stuxnet, a piece of code of a sophistication that did not belong to the ordinary world of malware, a weapon assembled from 4 separate zero-day exploits at a time when a single zero-day could sell for a fortune. So it's a program that understood the specific Siemens industrial controllers running the Iranian centrifuges and knew exactly which frequencies to nudge and exactly when to nudge them. It spun the rotors past their tolerances in brief, deniable bursts. It fed the monitoring stations recordings of healthy operation while the destruction unfolded beneath. It was patient. It was surgical. And by the time its signature was finally identified by a small antivirus firm in Belarus, roughly 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz had been destroyed, and the Iranian program had lost something more valuable than the machines themselves. It had lost certainty that its own walls were solid. No state claimed the weapon. No state has ever formally claimed it. The fingerprints, when investigators followed them, led through intermediaries and cutouts and contractors into the quiet corridors of 2 allied services, and there the fingerprints stopped. What the world was left with was the fact of the thing, the new fact, the fact that physical destruction could now be written in a language that traveled through cables and thumb drives, that crossed air gaps inside the pockets of unsuspecting technicians, that slept in systems for months before waking. The 21st century had found its first true weapon, and the weapon had been pointed at a mountain in central Iran. While the code worked in silence, the kinetic half of the campaign began to move through the streets of Tehran on the back of motorcycles. The scientists came first as names in classified files, then as names in newspapers. Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a particle physicist, killed by a bomb attached to a motorcycle outside his home in January of 2010. Majid Shahriari, senior figure in the nuclear program, killed by a magnetic device placed on the side of his car by a rider who pulled alongside in Tehran traffic and then disappeared into it. Dariush Reza-Ainejad, shot in front of his daughter's kindergarten. Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, a deputy director at Natanz, killed by another magnetic bomb on another morning commute. The pattern was deliberate, and it was readable. The men being removed were not politicians. They were the keepers of specific knowledge, metallurgists, enrichment specialists, weaponization theorists, the human repositories of the parts of a program that could not be rebuilt from textbooks. To kill them was to slow the program in a way that sanctions could not. Inside Iran, the response moved through stages. The services in Tel Aviv had anticipated public funerals, televised accusations, arrests of suspected networks, some real and some performative, tightening of security around remaining scientists that transformed their lives into something resembling house arrest, and beneath all of it, a quieter recognition that the enemy was not merely at the gates, but inside the compound, inside the supply chain, inside the software, inside the morning drive to work. Counterintelligence sweeps widened, foreign components were pulled and examined, and the program slowed and then adapted and then resumed, because programs of that scale do not stop for grief. What the shadow war had become by the early 2010s was something that had no precedent and therefore no doctrine. It was a conflict fought in units no treaty had ever contemplated. Lines of code, grams of enriched uranium, individual human beings whose deaths were measured in program months lost. The old categories of war, fronts, armies, declarations, had dissolved into something more intimate and more deniable, and the deniability itself had become a kind of architecture, a way of fighting that allowed both sides to escalate without ever quite admitting that escalation was underway. And then, on a quiet night in a warehouse on the edge of Tehran, the architecture of deniability would suffer its most spectacular breach. Section 10, the warehouse in Tehran. The building was the kind of building no one was supposed to notice. A plain commercial structure in the Shorabad district on the southern edge of Tehran, unmarked, unguarded in any way that would suggest its contents mattered, sharing a street with workshops and storage units and the ordinary commerce of a city that had long since learned not to ask what its neighbors kept behind closed shutters. There were no cameras worth the name. There were no patrols. The assumption, which had held for years, was that anonymity was its own protection. That a warehouse containing nothing in particular, in a district containing nothing in particular, would continue to contain nothing in particular for as long as no one had reason to look. On the night of January 31st, 2018, someone looked at the operation when it was later described in the sparing terms that services used to describe their own triumphs, had been planned for more than 2 years. A team on the ground, a window of hours, not days, the cutting torches calibrated to the specific safes inside, safes whose models had been identified in advance through means that were never disclosed. The team worked through the night on a schedule that allowed no improvisation. When they left, before the morning shift of ordinary Tehran began its ordinary commute, they carried with them what would later be counted as more than 50,000 pages of documents and 160-odd compact disks, the physical and digital memory of a program that Iran had spent 15 years insisting did not exist. The program had a name inside its own files, Project AMAD. The name appeared on letterheads, on organizational charts, on budget projections and personnel rosters, and the quiet procedural paperwork that any bureaucracy, even a clandestine one, cannot help but generate. The files described weaponization research, warhead design considerations, testing protocols, the specific engineering problems that must be solved to move from enriched uranium to a device that can be delivered. Much of the work had been conducted before 2003, the year the program was officially said to have been shelved. Some of the work, the archive suggested, had simply been renamed and redistributed into other institutions, kept alive in pieces, preserved against a day when the pieces might be needed again. The archive itself was the proof of preservation. One does not retain 50,000 pages of a program one has abandoned. 3 months later, standing in front of a blue curtain in Tel Aviv, with shelves of binders and disc cases arranged behind him, as theatrical evidence, the Israeli Prime Minister unveiled the Hall to the world in a televised presentation whose production values were closer to a product launch than to a traditional intelligence disclosure. The word he used was the word the documents had earned: lied. Iran lied. The atmosphere of the presentation was designed to travel, and travel it did, through cable channels and parliamentary chambers in the quieter rooms where nuclear inspectors read their briefings. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which had access to portions of the material, would later confirm the authenticity of significant elements. The denials from Tehran were immediate and, in their structure, unchanged from the denials of 2002 and 2003 and every year in between. And here was the strange thing, the thing that belonged more to the philosophy of the conflict than to its tactics. The revelation changed nothing, or more precisely, it changed everything and nothing at once. Governments that had already believed were confirmed in their belief. Governments that had chosen not to believe found reasons to continue not believing. The 2015 nuclear accord, already under strain, would collapse within weeks of the presentation for reasons that were related and unrelated and impossible to disentangle. The centrifuges at Natanz kept spinning. The centrifuges at Fordo kept spinning. The scientists who remained kept working under the shadow of the morning commute, under the shadow of the code that might be waking inside their systems, even now. What the warehouse raid revealed in the end was something the services on both sides had always privately known, that proof in a war of this kind was not a weapon. Proof was a kind of weather. It arrived and it changed the light for a little while, and then the war that had been underway beneath the weather continued to be underway because the machinery that sustained it had been built to survive the knowing of it. The archive was extracted, the truth was displayed, and the shadow, having been briefly illuminated, closed again around everything it had always contained, only now with a new pressure gathering inside it, a pressure that would hold for 6 more years before, on an April night in Damascus, it would finally break into the open. From Section 11, April 2024, the shadow breaks. The building in Damascus was a consulate in the way that many buildings in that quarter of the city were consulates, which is to say it was a consulate on its paperwork and something else on its upper floors. For years it had served as one of the quieter nodes in the architecture the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had built across the Levant, a place where officers passed through on their way to other places, where meetings happened that did not appear on any schedule, where the Quds Force conducted the patient coordination work that held the proxy belt together from Beirut to Baghdad to the southern suburbs of the Syrian capital. On the afternoon of April 1st, 2024, the upper floors of that building ceased to exist. And the strike was precise in the way these strikes had become precise over 2 decades of practice. A small number of munitions delivered from a distance, arriving within seconds of each other, collapsing the targeted floors without bringing down the structure entire. When the dust settled, the dead included Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, the senior Quds Force commander for Syria and Lebanon, a figure whose name had appeared for years in the classified files of services in several capitals and almost never in the newspapers. Around him, 6 other officers. The message embedded in the operation was legible to everyone who needed to read it. Once a line that had held for more than 40 years. The line that said senior IRGC commanders could be targeted in many places, but not inside what Iran considered its own diplomatic ground, had been erased in an afternoon. For 12 days, the world waited inside a silence that was not silence. Statements were issued. Warnings were delivered through the quiet channels that exist between adversaries precisely for moments like this. Analysts in every relevant capital wrote the same paragraph in slightly different words. The paragraph that said Iran would respond, must respond, could not afford not to respond, and yet could not afford a response that crossed into open war. The architecture of managed conflict, the architecture that had held since 1979 through every provocation and every assassination and every pipeline blown and every scientist killed on a Tehran morning, was being asked to absorb a shock it had never been designed to absorb. And for 12 days, it seemed that it might. Then, on the night of April 13th, the sky above Israel filled with something the sky above Israel had never contained before. More than 300 drones and missiles launched directly from Iranian territory, from Iranian soil, by Iranian forces, under the Iranian flag, without the mediating fiction of a proxy, without the deniability that had defined every previous exchange. In the long war, Shah drones in their slow formations, arriving first because they had the farthest to travel, cruise missiles behind them, and behind those are the ballistic missiles on their steep and terrible arcs, rising through the exosphere and beginning their descent toward targets in the Negev. The interception, when it came, was the largest coordinated air defense operation in the history of the state. Iron Dome at the lowest layer, David's Sling in the middle, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 reaching into the upper atmosphere to meet the ballistic threats at altitudes where the air itself is a technicality. American aircraft over Jordan, British aircraft over Iraq, French radar contributions, Jordanian interceptors engaging munitions that had crossed into their own airspace. A coalition that had never been formally announced found itself, for the space of a few hours, operating as a single organism above the desert. The overwhelming majority of the incoming weapons were destroyed in flight. A handful reached an airbase in the south and caused limited damage. A young girl in a Bedouin village was gravely wounded by falling debris. These were the physical results. The psychological results were of a different order entirely, because what had happened in the space of a single night was that the shadow war had stopped being shadow. The fiction that had sustained it, the fiction that Israel and Iran could fight each other indefinitely without ever quite fighting each other, that every strike could be denied, that every death could be absorbed into the deniable ledger, that the 45-year silence between the two states could coexist with the 45-year war between them, had been pierced by 300 flying objects and the acknowledgement from Tehran itself that Tehran had launched them. The line had been crossed. It had been crossed openly. It had been crossed under flags. In the days that followed, both governments worked with an intensity that resembled panic disguised as composure to contain what they had done. Israel's retaliation, when it came, was calibrated downward to a single strike near an Iranian air defense site at Isfahan, a strike announced by no one and acknowledged by no one, a strike whose purpose was to say that the rule still existed and to say it in the quietest voice available. Iran declared the matter closed. Israel declared nothing. The managed war, which had nearly shattered, was being hastily reassembled from its own broken pieces in real time, because the alternative to reassembling it was a war neither state could survive But the architecture that emerged from those April nights was not the architecture that had entered them. Something had changed in the grammar of the conflict, and everyone who read the grammar knew it. The threshold had been tested and found to be real, but also found to be movable. What had been unthinkable on March 31st was precedent by April 14th. And precedent in wars of this kind is the material from which the next escalation is eventually built. What the April exchanges exposed once the missiles had been counted and the interceptors tallied and the statements drafted and redrafted until they said almost nothing was something stranger than escalation. It was the site of two governments reaching almost in unison for the same set of tools: the deniable channel, the calibrated strike, the proxy whose fingerprints could be disowned by morning, and using those tools to pull themselves back from the edge they had just crossed. The shadow war in that moment revealed itself not as the residue of a failed peace, but as the peace itself, a peace in the only form two regimes of this kind could sustain it, a peace made of controlled violence. It is tempting, looking back across the decades the documentary has now traversed, to read the shadow war as a long accident, a series of missed exits, hardened positions, hatreds that compounded because no one stopped them, but the pattern is too consistent for accident. Every decade in both Tehran and Jerusalem, institutions were built, budgets were allocated, doctrines were written, careers were made. Entire directorates inside intelligence services existed for the sole purpose of managing the tempo of a war that was never permitted to become a war. Analysts were trained to read the other side's signals. Officers were promoted for their restraint as often as for their audacity. The architecture grew quietly the way coral grows, one small calcified decision at a time until the reef was the shape of the sea, and like coral, it served a purpose. It gave each regime something it badly needed. For the Islamic Republic, an external enemy close enough to justify the revolutionary state 60 years after the revolution, old enough to explain every shortage, every crackdown, every generation that had grown disillusioned with the promises of 1979. For the Israeli state, a threat distant enough to be managed, but vivid enough to unify a society whose internal fractures were widening year by year. The enemy was useful not because anyone in either capital cynically willed it so. The belief in the threat was, in most quarters, entirely sincere. But because the machinery that had been built to contain the threat could not, by its own logic, ever declare the threat resolved. To resolve it would be to dismantle the machinery, and the machinery by now was load-bearing. This is the harder truth the shadow war asks its observers to absorb. Not that the two states hated each other. Hatred would be simpler, and in some ways more hopeful, because hatred can cool. What grew instead was something closer to dependence, a dependence expressed through sabotage and assassination, and the quiet choreography of strikes that killed just enough people to matter, and never so many as to force a reckoning. Every cyber intrusion that failed to trigger retaliation, every drone that was intercepted before it could cross a red line, every general killed in a way that permitted the other side to respond without responding, all of it taught both regimes the same lesson again and again across 4 decades, that the war could be held, that the war could be fed, that the war managed carefully could be made to last. The proxies served this. Hezbollah, the militias in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, the networks of couriers and financiers and advisors threaded through half the region. They were not only instruments of pressure, they were insulation, is layers of deniability that allowed each blow to be absorbed without forcing the recipient into a public response that might spiral. The further the violence could be pushed from the two capitals, the longer the managed war could continue. Distance was the technology, deniability was the doctrine, and the men and women who lived inside the blast radius of that distance in southern Lebanon, in the suburbs of Damascus, in the border villages of northern Israel, were the currency in which the arrangement was paid. None of this was spoken aloud. No document in either archive calls the shadow war a system of regime maintenance. The officials who built it would have rejected the description, and most would have believed their rejection. But systems do not require their architects to understand them. Systems require only that the architects keep building. Section 13, the enemy as mirror. If the machinery was deliberate, the deeper question is what it was feeding. And the answer, the longer one sits with the 45 years the documentary has now crossed, is something more unsettling than strategy. Each regime over time came to need the other in a way that went beyond usefulness. The enemy became constitutive, a mirror in which each state could see the outline of itself, sharpened against the shape of what it had sworn to destroy. Consider what was lost on both sides for this mirror to hold. In Iran, an entire generation came of age knowing Israel only as the little Satan of the Friday sermons, a flat silhouette, an abstraction, a name chanted in squares. The Iranian pilots who had once trained in the Negev, each of the engineers who had once walked through Israeli factories studying irrigation and aviation and radar, the students who had once moved between Tel Aviv and Tehran as easily as between any two cities of the region. These people were not only forgotten, they were unremembered. Their photographs were removed from textbooks. Their cooperation was recast as the sin of a deposed regime, evidence of how far the Shah had strayed. The past was edited to match the present because a present this total could not tolerate a past this different. In Israel, the erasure took a quieter form, as erasures in open societies often do. The memory of the alliance was not suppressed so much as allowed to drift out of public vocabulary, surviving only in the footnotes of academic books and the memoirs of old intelligence officers who had trained their Iranian counterparts and still, decades later, spoke of them with a kind of grief. Younger Israelis grew up knowing Iran as the country of the nuclear program, the country of Hezbollah, the country whose president denied the Holocaust. The country of engineers who had once worked alongside their grandparents was not denied. It was simply no longer part of the story anyone told. And so two nations whose histories had been braided together for 30 years learned to see each other as if they had never met. The mirror, to function as a mirror, required this forgetting. Memory is the enemy of symbolic enmity because memory introduces specificity. And specificity dissolves the abstraction that hatred needs in order to remain hatred. A real Iranian, remembered clearly, is harder to hate than Iran. A real Israeli, remembered clearly, is harder to hate than Israel. The shadow war, to sustain itself, required that both peoples forget the other had ever been real in any way except as threat. What the mirror gave back in exchange for this forgetting was coherence. Each regime could point across the water and say, there, that is what we are not. The Islamic Republic defined its revolution partly by its opposition to the Zionist entity and could not easily articulate what the revolution was for without reference to what it was against. The Israeli state, especially in the years when its internal disagreements grew loudest, could reach for Iran as a unifier, a threat large enough to quiet at least briefly, the argument inside the room. The enemy was the thing both regimes could agree on when they could agree on nothing else. The enemy held the self together. There is a particular sadness in this, and the documentary has now arrived at the place where that sadness can finally be named. It is the sadness of watching two peoples, each with long memory and ancient dignity, each perfectly capable of imagining other lives for themselves, become locked into a story that now writes them more than they write it. And the tragedy is not that they are enemies. The tragedy is that enmity has become for both a form of self-knowledge. To release the enemy would be to release a part of the self that has grown around the enemy like bark around a wound. And neither regime at this point in its history knows how to do that. Perhaps no regime does. The mirror will hold as long as the forgetting holds. And the forgetting, 4 decades in, has become nearly complete, which is why the final question of this documentary is not about weapons or proxies or nuclear programs or the thresholds crossed in April. It is about memory, about what two nations chose across a generation to stop remembering, and about the single image kept in a few old archives that still waits at the beginning of the story the shadow war has taught everyone to forget. Section 14, the timeline. Nobody explains return now to the image the documentary opened with, Tehran in the middle years of the 1970s. A wide boulevard in the late afternoon, the light, the particular gold of that city in that decade. You have the traffic moving the way traffic moves in a capital that believes itself to be rising. Israeli engineers walking out of a building carrying folders, speaking quietly among themselves, nodding to Iranian colleagues who are heading in the other direction toward a meeting neither side considers remarkable. An El Al flight somewhere overhead beginning its descent, a pipeline far to the south carrying oil toward a Mediterranean port where Israeli tankers wait. None of the people in this image know they are standing inside the final years of something. They believe they are standing inside the beginning. The shadow war had no ancient root. That is the hardest thing to accept, and the quietest and the truest. It was not written into the soil of the region or into the scriptures of either faith or into any inheritance older than living memory. It was built slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. Built by a revolution that needed an enemy to complete itself, and by a state that learned over time to shape itself against the enemy the revolution provided. Built by arms dealers and intelligence officers and politicians who made small decisions in small rooms and went home afterward and slept, believing they had managed something, believing the managing would hold. Built by the forgetting that grew up around all of it until the forgetting was thicker than the memory it had replaced. What is built can, in principle, be unbuilt. The documentary is obliged to say this because it is true. Nothing in the architecture of the shadow war is written into the nature of either people, and nothing in it is beyond the reach of a different generation making different choices in different rooms. The periphery doctrine was a choice. The rupture was a choice. The proxies were a choice. The archive in the warehouse was a choice. And so was the raid that emptied it, and so was every strike, every interception, every silence held, and every silence broken. Choices accumulate into what looks like fate, but fate is only the shape choices leave behind when enough of them have been made. And yet, the unbuilding, if it comes, will not come soon. It will not come from this generation, which has invested too much of itself in the machinery to dismantle it, and it may not come from the next, which has inherited the forgetting as a kind of birthright, and will have to learn slowly what was forgotten before it can choose to remember. The timeline the documentary has traced does not end in resolution. It ends in a pause, a long, quiet pause of the kind that comes over a room when a story has been told all the way through, and the listeners are deciding, without speaking, what to do with what they have heard. The engineers in the Tehran Boulevard are still there, in the photographs, in the archives, in the memoirs no one reads. They are still walking toward their meeting. The light is still gold. The pipeline is still carrying oil. The decade has not yet turned, and the rupture has not yet come, and the shadow war has not yet been imagined by anyone who would later build it. Everything that followed is already possible in that image, and nothing that followed is yet required. The distance between the possible and the required is the distance the next generation, or the one after, will have to learn to cross in the other direction. That is where the timeline ends, not in a conclusion, in an image. Two peoples in a city in a decade doing ordinary work together under a sky that did not yet know what it was about to hold. The shadow war began when that image was allowed to be forgotten. It will end, if it ends, when the image is allowed to be remembered. Until then, the machinery turns, the mirror holds, the forgetting deepens, and somewhere in an archive almost no one visits, the photograph waits.